Good morning, everyone. Happy Thursday. This is Mr. Conway, and today we're going to be talking about learning. More specifically, we're going to focus on classical conditioning. All right, go ahead and check these out. Here's your objectives. We are going through a bunch today. We're going to be going from describing basic classical conditioning all the way up to identifying key contributors and everything in between, so hold on tight. All right, here's your first essential question that I'd like you to jot down. What is classical conditioning, and how did Pavlov's work influence behaviorism? Well, let's start off by figuring out who Pavlov is. I feel like this name might ring a bell. His early 20th century experiments are now psychology's most famous experiments. Okay, he explored classical conditioning. It also laid the foundation for many of psychologists John B. Watson's ideas. We'll be talking about Watson here in a little bit. But behaviorism in general is going to be a study field of psychology that's going to be essential to this learning chapter, okay? But first, let's look at what classical conditioning is. Classical conditioning, by definition, is a type of learning in which one learns to link two or more stimuli and anticipate events. Stimuli being some sort of outside force in our environment. In this example, it is lightning. And we anticipate events. So in this example, lightning happens, then thunder happens, which can be loud. So once we see lightning, we are then anticipating the thunder that is going to happen. So this person has been classically conditioned. Don't worry, we're going to go through many applications of it. Okay, so here's John Watson. So he is kind of seen as the father of behaviorism. Okay, behaviorism is the view that psychology should be an objective science that studies behavior without reference to mental processes. So you're going to be asked on tests like something about behaviorism, which of the following falls under the school of behaviorism. You're always going to be looking for some sort of like classical conditioning or learning type, okay? It does not have anything to do with mental processes. So if you can go through all the choices, you're going to find the one that deals with some sort of behavior, okay? Nothing to do with mental processes. All right. So real quick, what I want to do, okay, let's just move on. So the next essential question, how does a neutral stimulus become a conditioned stimulus? All right. I'd like you to pause this for a second and jot down this chart. Okay, are you back? All right, you're going to use this chart to fill in Ivan Pavlov's classical conditioning example, okay? So we're going to look at all four of these. We're going to look at unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned response, conditioned stimulus, and conditioned response. We're going to shorten these to US, UR, CS, and CR. Okay, so what we're going to do in order to get a handle on classical conditioning, because we're going to have to look at scenarios, we're going to use Pavlov's experiment as a reference point, okay? So if you're not familiar with Pavlov's experiment, what happened was he noticed that he was actually studying the digestive system of dogs, and he noticed that a dog would start salivating even before the food arrived, okay? So in his experiment, he would present food to a dog, it would salivate. Okay, so he wanted to see if he could get the dog to salivate without bringing the food, if it just thought that the food was coming. So what he did was he took a neutral stimulus, this tone. When he would strike this pitchfork, the tone would make a sound and the dog would not salivate. So what he did was, the actual conditioning part was, he paired the tone with the food. So the dog would salivate and also hear the tone. He did that enough times that then he could just produce the tone and the dog would start to salivate. That means that the dog has learned to associate that tone with food. And that is in itself classical conditioning. So we're going to look at each one of these parts, and I want you to fill them in on your chart as well as write down the definition. So the unconditioned stimulus is going to be the first one we're going to look at. In classical conditioning, it is a stimulus that unconditionally or naturally and automatically triggers a response. So you're going to be looking at what naturally triggers the response. So in this case, if the salivation is the response, then what naturally makes the dog salivate? Well, hopefully you're thinking to yourself, well, that's going to be the food, okay? Because the dog has a biological predisposition to want food, okay? If you just hit that tone, the dog's not going to salivate. It does not associate the tone with food yet, okay? But it does salivate at the sight of food. Okay, unconditioned response. So this is now going to be the dog's response to the unconditioned stimulus. So the response, if it's got a U in front of it, if it's unconditioned, it's going to be unlearned, meaning it's going to be very, very natural. Okay? So the natural response to the food is going to be the dog will salivate. Okay? Remember, it's a natural response and the dog has not been conditioned yet. So the unconditioned stimulus is the food. The unconditioned response is the dog will salivate. Okay, now the conditioning comes in. Now we're going to try to train this dog. So the conditioned stimulus in classical conditioning is an irrelevant stimulus, meaning it has nothing to do with anything. The after association with an unconditioned stimulus, meaning we're going to pair it with the food, and it comes to trigger a conditioned response. So this is kind of what's going on during conditioning. So the tone will be struck. Nothing happens to the dog. It probably just kind of looks at you with a sideways, that cute look. It doesn't know that that tone has anything to do with food. Okay? So during conditioning, the neutral stimulus, which is this tone, after it's paired with the food, it then becomes the conditioned stimulus after conditioning. So after the dog has learned that the tone is paired with the food, that neutral stimulus then turns into this, which is the conditioned stimulus. So don't get confused. The neutral stimulus and the conditioned stimulus should be the same. Now let's see if the dog has a conditioned response. So a conditioned response is now the response to the conditioned stimulus. Okay? The conditioned stimulus. So after conditioning has happened, you can strike the conditioned stimulus, the tone, and the dog will then have a conditioned response, which is salivation. Okay? After conditioning, the once neutral stimulus now has become the conditioned stimulus, which then, if the dog salivates to the conditioned stimulus, we call that the conditioned response. Now here's a hint. If conditioning is successful, the unconditioned response and the conditioned response should be the same thing. In this case, it is this, the dog salivating. So why don't you pause this? Can you identify look at Snoopy's cartoon. Can you identify the unconditioned stimulus and the rest of those parts in Snoopy's scenario? I'll see you on the next slide. Okay. In classical conditioning, what are the processes of acquisition, extinction, spontaneous recovery, generalization, and discrimination? Wow. So we're going to fly through some of these. Okay. In classical conditioning, acquisition is the initial stage when one links a neutral stimulus and an unconditioned stimulus so that the neutral stimulus begins triggering the conditioned response. Okay? So in this case, the acquisition will be, for our Pavlov experiment, when the conditioned stimulus is paired with the unconditioned stimulus. So acquisition is going to be when they take that tone or that bell and it's paired up with the food, and the dog understands that that tone is paired with the food. That's called acquisition. You can think of it as the dog is acquiring the conditioned stimulus. Okay, so here's a little chart. The book goes into this reference about a kiss leading to romantic arousal. If the person's first experience with a kiss, if the person has the onion breath, and then they experience a kiss, that'll lead to romantic arousal. So according to classical conditioning, this person can smell onion breath and will then be conditioned to experience romantic arousal. So that is an example that your book gives you. Okay, now extinction. This is going to be exactly what it sounds like. We know things are extinct, that they don't exist anymore. So this is when the conditioned response stops. So think about in Pavlov's experiment, if you kept ringing that bell and watching the dog salivate because it's expecting food, if you stop bringing it food, the dog will eventually not associate the food with the tone anymore. So what's going to happen is it will stop producing a response. Okay? It'll stop. So if you don't give that dog food when you strike that tone, he's going to unlearn it. It's not going to happen anymore. But then what can happen is spontaneous recovery is after you have extinguished that response, meaning let's say you were mean to the dog and you stopped giving the food after the tone for a long time and the dog stopped salivating, spontaneous recovery is when that salivating or that conditioned response just pops back up out of nowhere. And then it might continue to extinct a little bit. So spontaneous recovery, think of spontaneous, when people are just random, you got that spontaneous friend. And recovery, meaning it comes back or make up for it. So it's just like a random appearance after the conditioned response has been extinct. All right, generalization. This is the tendency once a response has been conditioned for stimuli similar to the conditioned stimulus to elicit similar responses. So there's a cartoon that says Pavlov, Pavlov's office, please knock, do not ring bell. Okay, and that's kind of like a joke. So if you rang a doorbell and a dog has been conditioned with a similar bell to think that food is coming, if somebody randomly rings the doorbell, the dog might generalize that doorbell for Pavlov's official bell, and it might start salivating, and it might not get any food, okay? Or if your phone goes off and a text bing, happens, the dog might generalize and think that that text sound is the conditioned stimulus, okay? And then this is going to be, almost done. The discrimination is going to be in classical conditioning, which is what we're going to focus on right now. The learned ability to distinguish between a conditioned stimulus and stimuli that do not signal an unconditioned stimulus. So this would be, basically the dog would be able to distinguish between a doorbell and his conditioned tone, the conditioned stimulus that has the tone. So actually it's kind of like the opposite of generalization, where discrimination, they can actually distinguish a difference between the two. Okay, we're going to do a couple more. Do cognitive processes and biological constraints affect classical conditioning? We're going to talk about learned helplessness. Learned helplessness can be applied to just about any area of life. It is the hopelessness and passive resignation an animal or human learns when unable to avoid repeated adverse events. Okay, some people think that we are raising a generation of children and students on learned helplessness. Okay, that students, when they face a problem, they are unable to get over it. And they're thinking that, psychologists think that this is a biological kind of thing. Okay, so don't experience learned helplessness, okay? If you have repeated events that are not, the outcome that you want, you need to keep trying. All right, that is learned helplessness. Now, this is an experiment that they did, romantic red. In a series of experiments that controlled for other factors such as the brightness of the image, men found women more attractive and sexually desirable when framed in red. So it's the same picture, but they realized that they found that this one on the right was more attractive. And we're going to look at the biopsychosocial influences on learning. So today's learning theorists recognize that our learning results not only from environmental experiences, but also cognitive and biological. So biological influences of learning could be everything from genetic predispositions, unconditioned responses, adaptive responses. Psychological can be previous experiences, predictability of associations, generalization, discrimination, social, cultural influences, culturally learned preferences, and motivation affected by the presence of others. Okay, so all these psychologists think attribute to our learning. And then these you don't have to write down, but I want you to look at these examples of classical conditioning. So it doesn't just happen with Pavlov and his dog. It's used for former drug users that often feel a craving when they are again in the drug using context, with people or in places they associate with previous highs. Thus, drug counselors advise addicts to steer clear of people in settings that may trigger these cravings. It's all about classical conditioning. Classical conditioning even works on the body's disease-fighting immune system. When a particular taste accompanies a drug that influences immune responses, the taste by itself may come to produce an immune response. So, for example, like if you are sick and you're throwing up and you eat, let's say your mom says, well, you should try to eat some breakfast, and you eat eggs and then you throw up, then now the smell of eggs might just make you nauseous. You might throw up because you've associated that with nausea. Okay, that's it. I will see you guys later. See you in class.